At 6:32 in the morning on April 21, 1944, Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell stood beside a P-51 Mustang at Debdon Airfield in England, watching a young man walk toward an aircraft that carried a single point of failure he could never repair. Lieutenant James Parker was only 22 years old, with 14 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills behind him, and he was about to fly straight into the densest wall of German fire the 8th Air Force had seen in months. Intelligence had just confirmed that the Germans had moved nearly 188mm flak batteries around Berlin, and Parker's escort mission to park him would take him directly through that storm. Mitchell had been maintaining P-51 Mustangs for 7 months. He knew every screw, every hose clamp, every component of the aircraft. The Mustang was a masterpiece of speed, range, and engineering, capable of outclimbing and outrunning anything the Germans could put in the air. But beneath that brilliance, beneath the gleaming aluminum skin and the power of its Merlin engine, lived a single vulnerability that was killing American pilots every week: the cooling system. The Rolls-Royce-designed Merlin engine that gave the P-51 its speed was liquid-cooled, relying on ethylene glycol flowing through tubes, passages, and a radiator mounted in the belly of the aircraft. 17 gallons of coolant circulated through brass lines, aluminum tanks, and unarmored piping exposed to the smallest piece of shrapnel. One bullet, one tiny hole anywhere in that system, meant the engine would overheat within minutes. 3 minutes if the hit was bad. 7 minutes if the pilot was lucky. 7 minutes to make an impossible decision: land, bail out, or try to fly a dying engine back across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. Training manuals spoke of doctrine and altitude and avoiding ground fire. But doctrine didn't stop bullets. Doctrine didn't protect coolant lines. Doctrine didn't keep pilots alive when the temperature needle crept past 100 degrees. Mitchell had watched it again and again. The 8th Air Force had lost over 500 P-51s in 6 months, and most weren't brought down by fighters. They were killed by ground fire, by fragments from flak bursts, by a single rifle round slipping through aluminum and slicing a coolant line. He had seen pilots limp home trailing white vapor like ghosts, seen engines scream and pound and finally seize as coolant ran dry. Some survived. Most didn't. And the official reports always blamed tactics, blaming pilots for flying too low or staying too long. But the mechanics knew the truth. The problem wasn't tactics. It was engineering. He remembered the first pilot he lost, Second Lieutenant David Chen. Chen had only been in the theater 4 weeks. He and Mitchell had bonded over California, talking about cars back home, grease under their fingernails long before they ever smelled aviation fuel. Chen returned from a mission on March 19th with white vapor streaming from his Mustang and the temperature gauge creeping toward disaster. A small round had ripped the belly of his aircraft during a strafing pass and clipped a return line. For 18 agonizing minutes, Chen tried to coax the engine home, watching the coolant temp rise with every mile. He made it across the channel. He made it to England. He made it within sight of the runway. The engine seized 4 miles short. The Mustang crashed and flipped. Chen was killed instantly. The official report blamed pilot error. Mitchell blamed the cooling system. And he never forgot the sound of Chen's engine as it died. Then came First Lieutenant William Morrison, a veteran with 9 kills, a man who knew the Mustang's strengths and weaknesses as well as anyone alive. On April 7th, escorting B-17s over Brunswick, a burst from an 88mm shell sent a single piece of shrapnel slicing through his fuselage, severing a coolant line from the header tank to the radiator. He stayed with the bombers for 6 minutes, keeping enemy fighters off them as his coolant boiled, as the temperature redlined, as the Merlin tried to tear itself apart. He headed west with his wingmen, but the engine went beyond the limits, 112 degrees, cylinder heads warping, power fading. He aimed for a beach on the Dutch coast. He almost made it. The Mustang cartwheeled and Morrison died in the wreck. Mitchell watched his friend Rodriguez break down that evening, unable to accept that one 2-inch piece of metal had killed one of the smartest pilots they had. Rodriguez pulled the maintenance logs for every P-51 lost in 3 months. 42 aircraft. 27 dead from coolant system failures after battle damage. 27 young men gone because the system had no armor, no backup, no protection. And while reports kept pointing to tactics, the evidence said otherwise. Most were hit at altitude, escorting bombers exactly as doctrine demanded. And still they died. By mid-April, Mitchell had watched 11 pilots from his squadron vanish or crash. He had signed off their maintenance forms, checked their coolant levels, tightened their clamps. He did everything the manual said. And it wasn't enough. The smell of glycol haunted him every morning. It filled the maintenance area, seeping into the metal floor, into his clothes, into his memory. It meant engines running, aircraft preparing for missions, and the possibility that at least one pilot that day would never return. The sound of an engine seizing, sudden silence where thunder should be, echoed in his nightmares. He had heard it too many times. On the night of April 20th, Parker found Mitchell working under a lamp, tools spread across a wing route. The young pilot asked him plainly, was there anything Mitchell could do to give him a better chance? Anything to help him survive the single bullet that could kill his engine and end his life? Mitchell looked at him, saw the fear in his eyes, saw the way veterans looked before their 20th mission. He wanted to lie, but he couldn't. He said the truth. Nothing could be armored. Nothing could be redesigned in the field. But he could double-clamp every coolant connection. It wouldn't stop a bullet, but it might give Parker a few more minutes if vibration loosened something. Parker nodded. Sometimes even the illusion of control was something. Mitchell worked alone until after 1 in the morning. He cracked his knuckles, climbed onto the wing, and removed the cowling. He double-clamped every connection, header tank, radiator inlet, cylinder head manifolds, placing a second clamp 90 degrees from the first. His hands were soaked in glycol. His back ached. But he finished the job. Reassembled the cowling. Cleaned his tools. Locked the hangar. And walked out into the cold night, hearing RAF bombers rumbling toward Germany, knowing Parker would be doing the same in 5 hours with no protection from the one flaw the Mustang carried like a curse. Parker took off at 6:52. Mitchell watched his aircraft disappear into the bright morning sky as 16 P-51s formed up and turned toward Germany. Then he waited. 4 hours and 37 minutes later, the returning formation appeared. 15 Mustangs. 1 missing. Parker's aircraft wasn't there. The operations officer delivered the news like they always did, plain, clinical, stripped of emotion. Parker had been hit by flak. Coolant leak reported. Stayed with the bombers through the target area. Broke off too late. Engine overheated. Vapor trail thick. Temperature past 110 degrees. Last seen descending over western Germany. No bailout reported. No wreck found. No confirmation. Just gone. Maybe a prisoner. Maybe dead. Maybe lying in a field no one would ever reach until after the war. Rodriguez found Mitchell that evening, angry, grieving, exhausted. 6 P-51s lost that week. More coolant failures. More pilots dead or missing. And there was still nothing anyone could do. The system wasn't designed to protect pilots. It was designed to meet specifications. No armor package. No redundant lines. No emergency coolant reserve. No options. Then, almost overnight, the 8th Air Force changed strategy. Major General Jimmy Doolittle freed the fighters. They no longer had to stay tied to the bombers. They could sweep ahead, hunt the Luftwaffe, attack airfields, and destroy German aircraft on the ground. It was brilliant, aggressive, and exactly the kind of mission profile that exposed Mustangs to the coolant vulnerability more than ever before. Strafing runs meant flying low. Flying low meant ground fire. And ground fire meant death. In May 1944, 93 P-51s were lost. 41% to strafing missions alone. Because at treetop level, you could bank, you could jink, you could dive, but you couldn't outrun a bullet aimed from below. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was one of the survivors. He had seen Chen die. He had watched Morrison go down. He had flown 26 missions and earned 5 kills. On May 19th, Hayes strafed a supply convoy near Reims. He pulled up at 200 feet and felt a hard punch beneath his left foot, a tiny hit, a small caliber round. The temperature needle jumped almost immediately. He called his wingman and turned toward England, watching the gauge climb toward the danger zone. At 106 degrees, he still believed he could make it. He calculated his distance. 40 minutes to Deb Dawn. 4 degrees of margin. But 8 minutes later, the temperature began to climb again. No turbulence. No power changes. Just coolant disappearing through a hole the size of a pencil lead. Hayes fought the engine, coaxing every last second from it. He watched the vapor trail thicken and darken, turning gray as burning coolant mixed with air. At 70 miles out, he hit 112 degrees. The engine began to vibrate. Cylinder heads beginning to warp. 50 miles. 40. 20. 10. The airfield was in sight when the engine finally seized. The propeller froze. Silence slammed into the cockpit like a hammer. Hayes pushed into a glide and prayed for enough altitude. He cleared the boundary at 200 feet, dropped the gear, and skidded onto the runway. Alive. Barely. 18 minutes from death. Mitchell found Hayes standing beside the ruined engine, hands trembling. They found the entry hole, 1 bullet, 1 tiny puncture in a coolant line. Enough to drain the entire system in 18 minutes. The Merlin was destroyed. Rodriguez and Mitchell worked late removing the engine, shaking their heads as dry coolant lines cracked in their hands. 14 cooling system failures in 6 weeks. 8 dead. 3 missing. 3 injured. And everyone unnecessary. Mechanics understood why this happened. The Mustang's cooling system was engineering brilliance paired with unavoidable fragility. It held 16.5 gallons of coolant in a system pressurized to 30 pounds per square inch, shared space with the supercharger intercooler, and relied on a single radiator assembly vulnerable to anything fired from below. It allowed the Mustang to fly farther and faster than anything in the sky, but a single hit turned that advantage into a death sentence. Pilots compared it bitterly to the P-47 Thunderbolt. The P-47 had an air-cooled radial engine. No coolant. No radiator. No fragile lines. A Thunderbolt could take engine hits that would kill a Mustang instantly. It could lose cylinders and keep flying. It had no single point of failure. Mitchell had seen P-47s come home looking like they'd been chewed apart by artillery, missing panels, oil spraying everywhere, and still land. The Mustang couldn't survive a hit from a rifle. And that was the contradiction. The P-51 Mustang might have been the best escort fighter of the war. It helped break the Luftwaffe. It escorted bombers to the heart of Germany. It changed the air war forever. But inside that beautiful machine, in the heart of its design, in the plumbing of its brilliant Merlin engine, lived a flaw every mechanic knew too well, A flaw that killed young men who were brave enough to fly straight into German flak with no way to protect the system keeping their engine alive. Mitchell ended many nights staring at the empty hardstands where aircraft should have been, wondering which pilot tomorrow would trust his life to a system that could fail from a single piece of metal the size of a fingernail. And every morning he returned, breathed the smell of glycol, tightened clamps, checked lines, and watched more pilots walk out to fight with a machine both magnificent and mortally vulnerable. A machine that could bring them home, until the moment it couldn't.